which is then signified visibly by the patches and the emblems that no one talks about. Now, if this was all just ordinary stuff, wouldn't you think they'd be telling you about it? But in fact, what we found was there were layers and levels that when you got beneath the symbology of the paintings and the emblems and the patches, and you know how important patches and emblems are to NASA. No missions fly without emblems or patches being designed. As you begin to look into these, you find that they're not just cute little artistic renderings or imaginings. They have levels and levels of meaning. And those meanings are then worked out in the actual operations of the various programs, be it landing on the moon, or flying by Mars, or going to Cydonia, or going to Jupiter or Saturn, et cetera, et cetera.
And NASA's new program for nuclear power propulsion is called Prometheus.
Well, that's another whole extraordinary discussion, and obviously we cannot even get into the details, so I would just commend people to the website, and you will find ample description and explanation and documentation of this, and I totally admit, absolutely bizarre model, bizarre theory. The last thing on the planet that I ever would have imagined. Now, science comes into its own when independent investigators take a look at the same data set and reach the same conclusions. So a few years after we, came to this ritual model, which is so astonishing and so unbelievable and so off the wall that I've had a hard time trying to put it into what are they really up to? It's like what's their point? What's the purpose? And we can get to that in a minute if you want to. But what we did is we published some stuff, and one of the people that kind of came to us and said they were intrigued to look at this separately was a gal named Mary Ann Weaver, who was a former Boeing engineer, good mathematical background, who sent me some emails several years ago. This is probably, 4 years ago, and said that she wanted to look into this and would I have any objections. And to the contrary, I said, by all means, be our guest if you want to see any of our, original data, how we worked up our data sets, what went into the model in the first place. Feel free to ask. So she did, and there is now present on the web. She has a paper which has been widely seen all over the world. It's linked through Enterprise, which is a mathematical analysis of the ritual alignment model. Not done by us, but done by someone who is totally separate, totally independent. The point is that her numbers were even more impressive in terms of statistical improbabilities that these alignments were due to chance. And she went not just through the Apollo program, but she began at the beginning of the lunar exploration program with the unmanned missions, the surveyors, the lunar orbiters, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that at the end of her study, she came to the conclusion, doing the proper statistical analysis, that the odds of this being just an accident were literally trillions to one. Trillions to one, Jim. So that, to me, is pretty impressive odds. And then, of course, it intrigued me that, well, if we were seeing this pattern in NASA activities, was it confined only to NASA? In other words, were other parts of the federal establishment, the federal government, doing things by this same set of rituals and same set of celestial? You could call it astrology, but it's not conventional astrology. It's something much more arcane, something much more mystical. And we found, God, yes, they are.
Interesting. Well, we're coming up on a break here. We're talking with Richard C. Hoagland, and we'll be right back. This is Radio Free Mars. Okay, we're back with Richard C. Hoagland. This is Radio Free Mars. Now, Richard, you recently wrote an article regarding the true colors of Mars and how it's possible for amateur astronomers to capture images of Mars with color closer to what the human eye would really see, and that's better than anything NASA has done, closer to real, anything NASA has done, including the Hubble Space Telescope and various Mars orbiter missions. Now, what's going on there? Can you explain why NASA is having trouble? Is it a technical issue, or is it just not important to them? They're more focused on the geology and whatnot than what the human eye would see, the colors there?
Well, color is important. I mean, first impressions of astronomical objects is what does it look like, which leads you to what is it made of, which leads you to how has it been weathered, how has it been changed by exposure to the elements, to erosive processes, oxidation, et cetera, et cetera. The fact that Mars is reddish, pinkish, whatever, is a telltale clue that it's covered with oxidized stuff. Well, oxidation really can only occur in the presence of lots of free oxygen. On Earth, the presence of free oxygen is a prerequisite, or not prerequisite, but is a direct result of the presence of biology, of life, photosynthesis. So one of the big questions, regarding what variant of the reddish color of Mars is really red, is why is it red? Where do the oxygen to oxidize the surface come from, if not through a process of biology? So the details are important. They used to say the devil is in the details. Well, I noticed, and as you've noted, we've published an article now in Enterprise, that when you compare the amateur astronomical community all over the world, different people, different sexes, different races, different countries, different national origins, their only link is they all love astronomy and they've all got money enough to get a CCD camera and a computer and a pretty good telescope. Their photography shows Mars pretty much the way visual observers have been reporting it for the last couple of hundred years. Pale salmonish pink with delicate, subtle shades of green and blues and, whatever. When you compare these amateur records now, computer technology, CCD imagery, charge-coupled device imagery, with the official images taken by NASA, you find a stunning disparity. The NASA images are all incredibly saturated. They're all very definitely red. They're all very definitely not subtle in any way, and they all universally make Mars look horrible. Like as Elton John said once in a song, not the kind of place to raise your kids. And the question then must be asked, is this deliberate?
Mm-hmm.
And we've been looking at a careful, preordained campaign to make Mars to the ordinary person as uninteresting, as dead, as boring as possible within the limits of the technology. Again, keeping the good stuff to themselves. Mm-hmm. And when you can compare side by side a picture taken with the Hubble and a picture taken with a small reflecting telescope in Portugal, which I think we did in one of our pieces, and you see that the Portuguese picture taken by an amateur corresponds exactly to the great visual observer descriptions ranging from Bernard to Lowell to others, and that the Hubble image is totally wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You got to ask yourself, what the hell's going on here? And I think it's part of a deliberate psychological campaign to make Mars unappealing, to make it lifeless as opposed to lifelike. And this all comes to a head when you look at the whole debate over the presence of water. We have had decades now where the assumptions based on ground truth, ground telescopic data, for instance, of the temperatures, that the temperatures along the equator are in the 70, 80 degrees. Well, water, in Fahrenheit scale, melts at 32, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have been told by NASA that the temperatures are sub-zero, sub-freezing,
mm-hmm.
that there's no possibility that water can ever exist, et cetera, because it's either too cold or the atmosphere is too thin or whatever. Well, a few years ago, about 3 years ago, I found an image, one of now thousands taken by the surveyor cameras, showing these dark streaks extending down from the edges of canyons and the rims of craters and any height down to an elevation below. And we put out a press release basically saying that this looked for all the world like water, like seepage, like liquid stuff that was moistening the ground and darkening it. NASA has fought this tooth and nail. They have gone into conniptions over people like Efren Palermo and Jill England and others who followed our work, who have basically tried to build a database substantiating the idea that this stuff is flowing current liquid water. When you look at the NASA published temperatures from Pathfinder and Viking, lo and behold, you find hidden in the data temperatures of the ground and even the air above the ground in the 70, 80 degree range. But the official press releases keep coming out of NASA, keep claiming that the ground temperatures are frozen and that any water is either as ice or it sublimes too quickly to ever become, an actual puddle.
Well, I think they're starting to come around, though, Richard. I mean, even just this week, there was a news article about seeing some dark streaks on the slopes of Olympus Mons, and that was an official NASA Mars Odyssey release. So, and they characterized it as possibly brine, a little saltier, so it would lower the freezing temperature, but still liquid water on the surface.
But it's taken how many years?
Yeah.
And these guys have all the money.
Right.
And they also have brains. Look, I have felt from day one that if we were ever to think that we were the smartest kids on the block, we would lose. That what we are finding, we are probably finding second or third or 10th. That, the best and the brightest, who are paid by your tax dollars, have found this stuff, and it's only when it becomes incredibly widely circulated and scientists outside the NASA community begin to look at their colleagues and say, wait a minute, Jim, that looks like water, that they're forced, kicking and screaming, to acknowledge the obvious. But then, of course, they never acknowledge who pointed up the obvious first. The press reports on this work does not reference our priority, our publication in 2000, et cetera, et cetera.
And they act like they never thought any different.
Yep. Well, it's the four stages of a discovery. The first one is it's impossible. The second one is you're crazy. The third one is, oh, yes. And the fourth one is, well, we do it all along. So we're, approaching the fourth stage for some of these things now. If that's true, by the way, eventually Cydonia will be acknowledged to be exactly what a very important group of us out here think it is, which is real. My point is this. If there are two NASAs, if there is an in-crowd and all the rest of us, if the good stuff is held tightly to the vest until they are forced under pain of, I don't know what, to grudgingly release it, to admit it, then the idea that we've been living with a fictitious Mars, which is incredibly hostile for life, for biology, for exploration, and that is not the reality. The reality is something much closer to the Mars that Lowell projected that he was seeing back at the turn of the last century. Then we've got to ask ourselves, what is the agenda driving these two disparate public presentations? And my answer, again, is that we're in the hands of people who think they have the God-given right to keep the good stuff for themselves because it's sacred and they're the only priesthood that's really allowed to deal with it, to work with it, to know it, and they're only releasing what they find in terms of real stuff when they are forced to by pressures from the rest of the scientific community or the political process. This is not the way to run a space program.
Well, on that note, if you were put in charge of NASA and you had to plan out the robotic exploration program and had a blank check from Congress to explore Mars robotically, now, what types of missions would you task NASA to design and fly?
Oh, my gosh. That's a really interesting question. That is so juicy. I notice you're constraining me to robotic missions.
Well, we're going to ask about humans to Mars after that.
Okay. All right, starting out, all right, first of all, there is this false dichotomy that I've heard as the excuse why JPL is not excited about some of these, developments, that if they make Mars too habitable, too friendly, too benign to biology, that they're going to lose control of their space efforts, that it will all go to the manned missions to Houston and they'll be left in the lurch. I don't agree with that at all.
No, nor do I.
And the reason I don't is not because of the theory, but because of fact. We have an historical precedent. It was called the Apollo program. JPL, before Kennedy announced Apollo, was in the backwater, suffering along with, $100 million or $200 million a year to try to put some sputtering probes past the planets and onto the moon. Once Apollo was announced, they got onto NASA. No missions fly without emblems or patches being designed.
Mm-hmm.
As you begin to look into these, you find that they're not just cute little artistic renderings or imaginings. They have levels and levels of meaning. And those meanings are then worked out in the actual operations of the various programs, be it landing on the moon or flying bizarre model, bizarre theory. The last thing on the planet that I ever would have imagined. Now, science comes into its own when independent investigators take a look at the same data set and reach the same conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
So a few years after we, came to this ritual model, which is so astonishing and so unbelievable and so off the wall, by Mars or going to Sidonia or going to Jupiter or Saturn, et cetera, et cetera.
And NASA's new program for nuclear power propulsion is called Prometheus.
Well, that's another whole extraordinary discussion, and obviously we cannot even get into the details, so I would just commend people to the website, and you will find ample description and explanation and documentation of this, and I totally admit, absolutely, but which is then signified visibly by the patches and the emblems that no one talks about. Now, if this was all just ordinary stuff, wouldn't you think they'd be telling you about it? But in fact, what we found was there were layers and levels that when you got beneath the symbology of the paintings and the emblems and the patches, and you know how important patches and emblems are, I've had a hard time trying to put it into what are they really up to? It's like what's their point? What's the purpose?
Mm-hmm.
And we can get to that in a minute if you want to. But what we did is we published some stuff, and one of the people that kind of came to us and said they were intrigued to look at this separately was a gal named Mary Ann Weaver, who was a former Boeing engineer.